The palace is dark, lit only by the wavering glow of torches that throw long shadows across marble walls. The senators stand in uneasy silence, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the man seated before them. Caligula is dressed not as an emperor, but as a god, draped in gold and jewels, his head crowned with laurel, his gaze sharp and unblinking. The room holds its breath, for when Caligula sat in judgment, every breath could be a last one. Suddenly, he claps his hands and laughs, the sound breaking the silence like a blade through flesh. Guards step forward, dragging a child into the hall. The boy cries out, his small voice echoing in the vast chamber as he claws against the hands that hold him. The senators shift, horrified but powerless, as the emperor watches with delight. His laughter fills the chamber, echoing against the stone as the boy is thrown before his feet. What happens next is left unspoken, for the cruelty of Caligula was never confined by words. You think you know Caligula. You've heard of mad banquets, of games soaked in blood, of whispered tales of incest, but those are only fragments, pieces of a nightmare that was far darker than the stories passed down in rumor. What you are about to hear are 7 practices so horrific that even ancient historians struggled to record them. 7 acts that pushed Rome to its breaking point, that blurred the line between power and madness, and that left scars deep enough to echo for centuries. And the last of them, the final practice of Caligula's reign, may be the most disturbing act ever committed by a Roman emperor, one you've likely never heard in full, and one you will not forget. Before diving into these forgotten stories of madness and cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The feasts of Caligula were never simple gatherings. They were weapons, designed with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Where most emperors used banquets to display wealth or generosity, Caligula turned his dining table into a stage of humiliation, one where Rome's most powerful men and their families were reduced to trembling spectators in his private theater of cruelty. When an invitation arrived, no senator dared decline. To refuse a summons from the emperor was to court suspicion, and suspicion in Caligula's Rome was as fatal as a blade. So the nobles came, adorned in their richest robes, their wives dressed in jewels and silks, their faces painted with practiced smiles. Beneath those smiles was dread. Everyone knew that a banquet with Caligula was not a night of feasting, but a test of survival. The dining hall glittered with torchlight, shadows dancing on marble columns and golden ceilings. Slaves rushed between couches, pouring wine into silver cups, laying platters of roasted meat and exotic delicacies before the guests. Musicians strummed softly, their notes weaving a fragile calm over the room. At the head reclined Caligula himself, adorned in garments that blurred the line between emperor and deity. His eyes roamed not over the dishes, but over the faces and bodies of his guests. He toasted the senators, spoke with charm, laughed loudly at jokes that dared not fall silent. Yet beneath the performance there was a tension everyone could feel. At any moment, the feast could turn. The nobles ate carefully, their words measured, each gesture calculated to avoid attracting the wrong kind of attention. And then, inevitably, Caligula would strike. With a smirk or a sudden gesture, he would summon a senator's wife to stand. Sometimes he extended a hand with mock gallantry, as though leading her to a dance. Sometimes he simply ordered her forward, his voice sharp, his tone brooking no refusal. The husband could do nothing. Even the faintest protest would be seen as defiance, and defiance could mean ruin. But it gets worse. The emperor would lead the woman away, disappearing into an adjoining chamber, while the hall fell into suffocating silence. The guests sat frozen, staring at their cups or their food, straining not to hear the muffled sounds that seeped through thin walls. Every passing minute was a reminder of their helplessness. When Caligula returned, his grin stretched wide, his robe loosely gathered, the room filled again with noise. But it was the noise of forced laughter, strained voices, and the heavy silence of shame. The cruelty did not stop at suggestion. Caligula often described the encounter in front of the entire table. He spoke of the woman's body, her skill or her supposed failings, reducing her to a subject of ridicule. He boasted as though speaking of a conquest on the battlefield, while her husband sat beside him, his face burning, forced to endure the degradation without a word. The women were humiliated, the men emasculated, and the entire Senate was reminded of their impotence. Suetonius, the Roman biographer, preserves some of these stories. He describes the banquets as not merely indulgent excess, but calculated acts of domination. Caligula weaponized lust. By violating the wives of senators, he shattered the sanctity of marriage, the cornerstone of Roman honor. Every man who reclined at his table knew that the emperor could take not only his power and wealth, but his wife, his dignity, and his pride. The strategy was as clear as it was cruel. A senator could survive political defeat, even exile. But to be publicly cuckolded by the emperor, to sit in silence while your wife was dragged away and mocked, that was a wound that destroyed reputation. Rome thrived on image, on honor, carefully cultivated. Caligula reduced those values to ashes with nothing more than a smile and a casual command. For the women, the humiliation was no less severe. They were paraded as trophies, stripped of agency, their reputations shredded. Resistance was impossible. To cry out in anger or shame was to bring punishment on their families. To endure in silence was to live as a reminder of their husband's disgrace. Whether noble or common, no woman was untouchable once she entered the emperor's hall. The cruelty lay not just in the act, but in the ritual repetition. The banquets were frequent, and with each new feast came a new victim, a new husband broken, a new household tarnished. The pattern itself became a source of dread. Invitations carried weight not of honor but of fear. The palace became a gilded trap, its marble halls echoing with laughter that masked despair. Caligula relished the discomfort. He raised his cup to toast his guests, his words sharp with mockery. He teased the men, dared them to react, watched the flush on their faces as their wives were reduced to objects of his pleasure. The musicians played on, the slaves poured more wine, and the senators sat in silence, swallowing humiliation with every sip. Whispers spread through Rome about these feasts. Some dismissed them as rumors too grotesque to be true. Others believed every word, for the senators who attended the banquets returned, changed, their pride hollowed, their reputations scarred. But whether whispered in markets or recorded by historians, the stories carried the same truth. These banquets were not indulgence. They were deliberate acts of destruction. This was Caligula's genius for cruelty. He did not always need executions to break his enemies. He used shame as a blade sharper than steel. By turning Rome's noblest women into instruments of mockery, he destroyed the men who ruled the empire beneath him. And by forcing those men to sit in silence, he proved that no law, no tradition, no bond of marriage could restrain his will. Imagine the weight of that silence after one of these humiliations. The emperor reclines again, laughing, describing what he had just done. The husband clenches his fists beneath the table, his eyes fixed downward. The wife sits rigid, her face pale, her dignity stripped away before her peers. And the rest of the room swallows hard, thankful it was not them, fearful of when their turn might come. This was only the first act of Caligula's theater of horror. The banquets revealed his hunger not just for flesh, but for power, expressed through humiliation. If the wives of Rome's noblest families could be degraded at his table, what could stop him from violating the sanctity of his own household? If strangers were used this way, what horrors awaited those who shared his blood? This was the natural progression of his cruelty. After reducing Rome's noblest families to silence at his table, Caligula turned inward, directing that same appetite for domination against his own blood. If strangers could be humiliated without consequence, what stopped him from desecrating the very bonds that Roman society held most sacred? Nothing. For Caligula, family was not protected by tradition. Family was simply the nearest stage upon which he could perform. Among his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and Drusilla, one became the center of his obsession. Drusilla was treated not as a sibling, but as a consort. The whispers of Rome said that she shared his bed as a wife, that the emperor flaunted her presence at his side with the pride of a man presenting his queen. At banquets, she reclined near him, seated in the place usually reserved for an empress. When he appeared before the people, she was paraded as though she were his chosen partner, her presence calculated to shock. To Romans, incest was not just shameful, it was unthinkable, the sort of accusation whispered as slander against enemies. Yet Caligula did not seem to care about whispers. He turned rumor into spectacle, daring anyone to challenge him. By parading Drusilla as his consort, he wasn't merely indulging a personal passion, he was tearing down one of the foundations of Roman morality. He was showing that even the most unshakable taboos could be twisted into theater if he willed it. Agrippina and Julia were not spared from this darkness either. Ancient accounts suggest that they, too, were caught in his orbit, taken as lovers or, at times, handed off to his companions as though their value existed only in how they could be used to entertain and degrade. Historians disagree on the details, but the fact that multiple sources accused him of these acts tells us how strong the perception was. Even centuries later, Caligula's treatment of his sisters remained one of the most infamous parts of his legacy. Drusilla, however, was always the one he favored. Some accounts claim that she became pregnant during their relationship, and that the father of her child may have been her brother. Whether this is rumor or truth, the very existence of such whispers reveals how deeply Caligula had blurred the line between fact and scandal. In his reign, what should have been unimaginable became believable. When Drusilla died in 38 CE, Caligula's grief exploded into something more disturbing than mourning. He did not merely weep. He did not quietly bury her with honor. Instead, he declared her divine. Statues were raised in her likeness. Priests were appointed to conduct sacrifices in her name. Across Rome, incense burned not just for the emperor, but for his dead sister, now worshipped as a goddess. Rome had deified emperors before. Julius Caesar was honored after death, and Augustus was worshipped as divine. But to elevate a sister, one he had openly treated as a consort, was grotesque in the eyes of the people. The act blurred every boundary. Family, religion, and politics twisted together into a single scandal. To worship Drusilla was not to honor tradition. It was to bow before Caligula's desecration of it. The funeral rites themselves became the subject of rumor. Some said that the ceremonies went beyond Roman custom, that they took on a character that felt more ritualistic, even unnatural. Ancient writers hint at rites that resembled obsession more than grief. The idea that Caligula treated her body not as something to be mourned, but as an object to be exalted, unsettled, even those accustomed to the brutality of empire. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they reflect the way Romans perceived him, a man who could not distinguish between love and possession, between mourning and control. The senators, already humiliated at his banquets, now had to stand in temples and burn incense for a woman they knew had been his lover as much as his sister. Each bowed head was a reminder of how powerless they were. To refuse worship was treason. To comply was degradation. Every offering of wine, every whispered prayer, was less an act of piety than an act of submission to the emperor's madness. The people whispered too. They spoke of Drusilla as the emperor's true wife, of Agrippina and Julia as unwilling partners in his corruption. They traded rumors of orgies, of jealousies, of rivalries within his own household. The palace, in their imagination, was no longer the seat of empire, but a house of incest and blasphemy. For a culture built on the sanctity of family honor, this was more terrifying than executions in the arena. It suggested that no boundary, not law, not religion, not blood itself, could contain the emperor. This practice was not indulgence hidden behind closed doors. It was flaunted. By blurring the lines between sister and wife, between funeral and ritual, Caligula turned his household into a grotesque mirror of Rome itself. The empire's most sacred institutions, family, marriage, religion, became tools in his performance of domination. Just as he had humiliated nobles in the dining hall, he humiliated Rome by forcing it to worship the memory of a relationship that should never have existed. And yet, this desecration of family, as horrifying as it was, did not satisfy him. Caligula's cruelty was not limited to private scandal. It stretched outward, onto the very men who were supposed to rule alongside him. If he could degrade his sisters and demand their worship, what chance did the Senate have of preserving its dignity? After parading his sisters as consorts and forcing Rome to bow before his desecration of family, Caligula turned his cruelty on the very men who embodied the dignity of the empire. The senators, heirs to centuries of tradition and power, became the next stage for his theater of humiliation. These were not nameless slaves, not conquered foreigners. They were Rome's ruling elite, men whose authority had shaped law and custom for generations. And yet, in Caligula's Rome, their togas carried no protection. From the start of his reign, he made it clear that the Senate existed not as partners in governance, but as pawns in his games. In public ceremonies, senators were ordered to grovel before him, bowing until their foreheads touched the ground. They ran beside his chariot like slaves, guiding their master, panting in the dust while he rode above them with a grin. Some were commanded to kiss his feet in full view of the people, their dignity erased in the instant their lips touched his sandals. The humiliation was deliberate. By reducing senators to servants in front of the public, Caligula inverted the hierarchy of Rome. The men who once claimed to be guardians of the Republic, who had advised emperors and dictated laws, were now props in the emperor's charade. Each bow, each step in the dirt beside his chariot, was a reminder to the crowd that Rome's nobility was powerless against him. But he did not stop at forcing them into gestures of submission. Caligula delighted in making senators act out roles that stripped them of every shred of honor. He compelled them to appear in costumes, to sing and perform in the theater like common actors. In Rome, acting was considered shameful for anyone of noble birth, and yet here were senators, men of lineage and title, stumbling through lines, their voices shaking, while the emperor and his court jeered. Some were even forced to fight in mock gladiatorial bouts, their noble hands gripping weapons they had never trained to wield, their bodies trembling under the eyes of the crowd. This was not random cruelty. It was a system of degradation. By making the most powerful men in Rome kneel, sweat, and humiliate themselves, Caligula ensured that no one could stand against him. The Senate became a hollow body, stripped of will, its members too broken by shame to resist even the most outrageous commands. What had once been the beating heart of Roman politics now throbbed only with fear. The senators bore these humiliations with clenched teeth and lowered eyes. In private, they may have raged, whispered, even dreamed of resistance. But in public, they endured. To protest was to invite not only disgrace but death. Caligula's reign thrived on such performances, because each act of submission was a visible display of his absolute dominance. Roman historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio record these episodes with disgust. They described the Senate as cowed, stripped of dignity, their noble traditions mocked in the streets. Citizens watched as the men who were supposed to lead them acted like slaves, and in that spectacle, Caligula reshaped the very perception of power. The people no longer looked to senators as figures of authority. They looked to the emperor, who alone held the power to elevate or destroy. Imagine the scene: a procession winding through Rome, the emperor riding in a gilded chariot while senators, their togas stained with dust, jog beside him, their faces flushed with shame. The crowd laughs or stares in silence, knowing better than to show pity. Later, those same senators appear in the theater, their voices breaking as they stumble through lines under Caligula's watchful eye. The emperor leans back, smiling, His delight fed not by the performance itself, but by the sight of Rome's proudest men reduced to trembling actors. The genius of this cruelty lay in its publicity. Executions could silence opposition, but humiliation destroyed reputations. Once a senator kissed the emperor's feet before the people, he could never reclaim his authority. Once a nobleman sweated in the dirt beside Caligula's chariot, he was marked forever as a servant. The shame lingered longer than death, corroding the Senate from within. And still, Caligula's appetite grew. It was not enough to humiliate in public ceremonies or in theaters. He extended his power into the Senate House itself, mocking their debates, interrupting speeches with laughter, treating their traditions as if they were childish games. He demanded divine honors from them, insisting that they treat him not merely as emperor, but as a god. Each time they obeyed, they dug themselves deeper into degradation, proving their loyalty not to Rome, but to one man's madness. The senators, trapped between survival and dignity, chose survival. They bowed, they kissed, they performed. They lived another day, but at the cost of their legacy. The institution that had once rivaled kings, that had outlasted dictators and generals, now crumbled beneath the weight of Caligula's laughter. This was humiliation as policy. This was Rome's ruling class dismantled not by swords but by shame. And as terrifying as it was to watch senators debased, one truth made the horror deeper. If the empire's most powerful men could be reduced to such degradation, what hope was there for those with no power at all? After parading his sisters as lovers and forcing Rome to bow before their worship, Caligula turned to the men who once believed themselves untouchable. The senators, guardians of Roman tradition, heirs to centuries of power, found themselves stripped of their dignity in ways so calculated that even death might have seemed kinder. If he could degrade his own blood, what chance did the Senate have? None. And Caligula wanted to prove it. From the first days of his rule, he made it clear that the Senate was not a partner in power, but a stage for his performance. He ordered senators to grovel at his feet, pressing their foreheads to the marble like slaves. He forced them to run beside his chariot, their togas dragging in the dust, sweat pouring down their faces while he rode in gilded splendor above them. And when they gasped for air, he laughed. For Caligula, their humiliation was the true spectacle. But it gets worse. Some senators were made to kiss his feet in front of the crowd, their lips touching the sandals of a man who mocked them as they bent. Imagine the silence in those moments, the most powerful men of Rome on their knees, the people watching, the emperor smirking. What was once the dignity of centuries crumbled into a theater of shame. And he did not stop there. For Caligula, humiliation had to be public, and it had to be creative. He forced senators into roles no Roman noble would ever accept. Some were dressed in costumes and ordered to sing or act in plays, stumbling across the stage like clumsy actors while the emperor and his court jeered. In Rome, to perform was disgraceful for a man of rank. Yet here were Rome's leaders, voices cracking, faces pale, enduring the jeers of the very people they were meant to govern. Worse still, some were pushed into the arena itself, forced to play at being gladiators, gripping weapons they did not know how to wield. These men, descended from families that had shaped the laws of Rome, now stood sweating under the sun, mocked as they stumbled through combat for the amusement of one man. To lose was shame. To survive was humiliation. Either way, the dignity of the Senate bled out into the sand. And what happened after was even more corrosive. Once a senator was seen groveling in dust, once he kissed the emperor's feet, once he played the clown before the people, he was ruined forever. Executions erased opponents quickly. Humiliation destroyed them slowly, ensuring that even if they lived, they carried the mark of submission to their graves. The Senate chamber itself was no refuge. Caligula mocked debates, interrupted speeches with laughter, and turned their most solemn traditions into childish games. He demanded divine honors, forcing senators to treat him not only as their emperor, but as their god, and they obeyed. They bowed, they offered sacrifices, they spoke words of worship, each one hollow, each one a nail in the coffin of their dignity. The genius of this cruelty was in its permanence. A man could survive exile, even disgrace, and rebuild, but how could he erase the memory of kneeling in the dirt before a laughing emperor? How could he regain authority once he had been dressed as an actor and jeered by the crowd? Caligula knew the answer. He wasn't simply mocking them, he was erasing them as leaders. Picture the scene. A grand procession through Rome, Caligula in a golden chariot, smiling as senators jog in the dust beside him, robes heavy with sweat, faces flushed with shame. The crowd watches, some laughing, some silent, all of them learning the same lesson, that the old guardians of power were nothing but puppets now. Later, those same men stumble through lines in the theater, their voices shaking while the emperor lounges in delight. Their families watch in horror, powerless to intervene. Their legacies dissolve in the sound of Caligula's laughter. And yet, it gets worse still. The senators endured all of this in silence, because to protest was to die. They whispered in private, they clenched their teeth in shame, but in public they bowed. Rome, the city that once prided itself on dignity and order, now saw its leaders broken daily in performances of degradation. This was humiliation as policy. Caligula didn't need to execute them all. Shame was sharper than the sword. He broke the Senate not by spilling blood, but by spilling dignity. Each act of groveling submission was more devastating than any massacre, because it corroded the very foundation of Rome's ruling class. And if the men who had shaped Rome's laws for centuries, the most powerful men in the empire, could be reduced to panting beside a chariot and kissing the emperor's sandals, what hope did anyone else have? If this was the fate of the mighty, imagine what happened to those who had no power at all. After grinding the Senate into the dust and turning Rome's proudest men into props for his amusement, Caligula moved on to the one tool that could spread fear faster than humiliation: random death. For the emperor, executions were not about justice, nor even about punishment. They were about terror, the kind of terror that could reach anyone, anywhere, for any reason. And in his Rome, death came as easily as a whim. People could be executed for things so trivial that, even in a city accustomed to cruelty, it felt unreal. A man might be killed for wearing the wrong kind of jewelry in the wrong place. Another for speaking too loudly in the wrong tone. Someone else for looking at the emperor too long, or not long enough. No warning, no trial, no chance for defense. The order was given. The swords were drawn, and blood was spilled. Caligula's power was absolute, but what made it more terrifying was its unpredictability. And it gets worse. He delighted in making a spectacle of death. On some days, he had prisoners lined up and ordered that every 10th man be executed, chosen at random. There was no crime, no distinction, no logic. A nod from the emperor decided who lived and who died. Imagine standing in that line, hearing the man beside you struck down, knowing that with a flick of Caligula's hand, your turn could come next. This was not justice. This was terror refined into a game of chance. But what happened after was even more haunting. These executions were not hidden in the dark corners of prisons. They were staged before audiences, often during festivals or public gatherings, timed between acts of entertainment. Caligula did not waste the crowd's attention. While people waited for plays to resume or games to begin, he filled the pauses with blood. Prisoners were dragged out and executed as though they were nothing more than interludes between performances. The message was clear. Life in Rome under Caligula could end not with meaning, but with mockery. The cruelty reached beyond the condemned. Parents were forced to watch their children executed, the sight seared into their memory forever. Children were made to see their parents struck down, left in shock and silence as the crowd murmured. These were not punishments for rebellion or treason. They were psychological warfare. By making families watch each other die, Caligula sent a warning that spread farther than any decree. No bond of love, no shield of innocence could protect against him. Roman historians record how deeply this cut into the psyche of the city. Suetonius and Cassius Dio tell us of executions carried out on the smallest pretext of death sentences, delivered with laughter. One story describes Caligula entertaining guests at a banquet, pointing casually to someone in the crowd and ordering their execution, then smiling as the man was dragged away. Another account tells of people summoned for an audience who never left the palace alive, their absence explained only by whispers. The unpredictability of it was the point. Fear was no longer tied to guilt or innocence. Fear became universal, and worse still, Caligula sometimes lingered to watch. He enjoyed the moment when realization dawned in the victims' eyes, when they understood that death had been chosen for them not because of anything they had done, but because he had willed it. He delighted in the tears of parents, in the silence of crowds too stunned to cry out. His cruelty fed on reaction as much as on blood. The psychological weight of this was crushing. In an empire where execution could strike anyone, no one felt safe. Senators, citizens, even the emperor's closest attendants lived with the constant knowledge that the next glance, the next word, the next breath could be their last. And because the reasons were trivial, no one could plan, no one could prepare. Survival depended not on loyalty or caution, but on luck. Rome itself became a city of gamblers, every man wagering his life on the toss of Caligula's whims. This randomness corroded more than morale. It corroded order itself. Under previous emperors, even the cruel ones, executions were at least cloaked in a sense of justice. Accusations of treason, conspiracies, plots. Under Caligula, those pretenses dissolved. The machinery of the state was not the law. It was the emperor's moods. One day he spared, the next he killed. The result was the same. A people frozen in terror, never knowing if they would see another dawn. Picture the forum on such a day. Crowds gathered, expecting the usual proceedings, when suddenly guards drag out a row of prisoners. The emperor raises his hand, points without explanation, and the blades fall. Some in the crowd gasp, others look away, but everyone feels the chill that runs deeper than the spectacle itself. If a man could die for wearing a necklace, who could claim to be safe? And yet, this was not even the full extent of the horror. Death, as final as it was, could still be quick. For many, a sword strike was almost merciful compared to what Caligula devised for those he wanted to break more completely. Because for some victims, the emperor created a punishment worse than death, a cruelty designed not to end a life, but to destroy it piece by piece, leaving survivors trapped in a living nightmare. After turning executions into games of chance and forcing families to watch each other die, Caligula showed that blood was not the only currency of his cruelty. He also discovered that humiliation could be sold, bought, and consumed like a commodity. And so, in one of the most bizarre and degrading acts of his reign, he transformed the very palace of the Caesars into something Rome had never seen before, a brothel. The Palatine Hill, seat of power and tradition, had long symbolized the majesty of Rome. Its marble halls were meant to project dignity, to remind visitors that the emperor was the guardian of the empire. Under Caligula, those halls became a marketplace of shame. He ordered sections of the palace converted into brothel chambers, staffed not by common prostitutes, but by Rome's noblest women and even men of rank. Those who once commanded respect were suddenly reduced to servants of lust, paraded like merchandise for whoever entered. And it gets worse. This was not a hidden indulgence. It was public, deliberate, and orchestrated. Caligula announced it openly, as though daring Rome to object. Citizens were invited into the palace itself, lured with the promise of spectacle. But what awaited them was not an ordinary brothel. It was a theater where the degradation of Rome's elite was put on sale. Noble women who once walked proudly in the forum were now displayed in the emperor's chambers, their dignity auctioned off under his watchful eye. Men of noble birth, dressed in finery that mocked their station, were forced to serve as well, their humiliation complete as common citizens mocked and pawed at them. Visitors did not pay with coins alone. Ancient accounts suggest that Caligula demanded tribute not in money, but in submission, in the willingness to degrade oneself before the emperor's gaze. To walk through those doors was to offer your dignity as a sacrifice, to prove loyalty not with words, but with debasement. Every act carried out in those chambers was less about pleasure than about demonstrating that no rank, no family, no reputation stood higher than Caligula's will. Roman historians, scandalized, recorded these acts with disgust. Suetonius writes of the palace brothel, describing how Caligula filled it with matrons and noblewomen, forcing them to prostitute themselves while the emperor watched. Dio Cassius echoes the account, emphasizing the shock of Romans who realized their emperor had turned the imperial palace into a house of vice. These were not fringe rumors whispered by enemies. They were consistent stories across multiple sources, a testament to how deeply this scandal burned into Rome's memory. Imagine the impact. A senator who had once governed provinces now stood powerless as his wife was summoned to the palace, forced to sit behind curtains and wait for strangers to pay for her use. A young man of noble blood, once trained to lead armies, was instead paraded like a toy in front of jeering citizens. The humiliation was not just personal, it was systemic. By turning the palace into a brothel, Caligula announced that the empire's highest families were nothing more than his property, to be used, degraded, and discarded as he pleased. And yet, what happened inside those chambers did more than humiliate individuals. It mocked Rome itself. The Palatine Hill, once the symbol of Roman order, now stank of vice. The emperor's residence had become indistinguishable from a marketplace of flesh. Citizens who entered the palace left not in awe, but in disbelief, carrying stories that spread through the city like wildfire. Every retelling reinforced the same message. Rome's dignity was gone, sold by the man who claimed to rule as a god. But it gets worse still. Caligula sometimes selected the women himself, walking through the chambers as though inspecting wares. He mocked their reluctance, laughed at their tears, and ridiculed husbands who clenched their fists in silence while their wives were paraded. For him, the brothel was not about pleasure. It was about breaking pride, stripping away the last illusions of nobility, and showing that he alone determined the value of Rome's most respected names. Few details of this practice survive compared to his executions or his incest, and that silence speaks volumes. Roman historians, already accustomed to recording scandal, struggled to describe the sheer perversity of turning the seat of empire into a brothel. Some passed over it quickly, perhaps fearing disbelief. Others wrote of it in tones of horror, as if even putting it to parchment might corrupt the page. That it was attested at all is proof of how unforgettable the act was, how deeply it seared itself into the collective memory of Rome. Picture the scene. A palace once filled with the echoes of statesmen debating laws, now filled with the whispers of transactions and the muffled sobs of the humiliated. Slaves carrying torches lead strangers down corridors where senators' wives wait behind curtains. Men of noble birth, forced into roles beneath them, try to mask their shame while citizens laugh. And somewhere in the shadows, Caligula watches, drinking in the humiliation as if it were the finest wine. This was not madness in the sense of a man lost to reason. It was a strategy of control. By corrupting the palace itself, he corrupted the image of Rome. By forcing the nobility into prostitution, he destroyed the foundation of honor that upheld their power, and by inviting common citizens to witness it, he proved that his reach extended into every corner of society. It was not just scandal, it was policy. And yet, as debased as this spectacle was, it was not the peak of Caligula's depravity. The palace brothel revealed his hunger for humiliation, but his ambitions stretched beyond vice. To dominate bodies was not enough. To destroy dignity was not enough. Caligula wanted more. He wanted to transcend humanity itself, to blur the line between man and God. and to force the entire world to worship him in ways Rome had never seen before. By turning the palace into a brothel, Caligula had already desecrated the heart of Rome. But humiliation and debauchery were not enough for him. He wanted more than to rule men's bodies. He wanted their souls. And so he crossed a boundary even tyrants had feared to touch. He declared himself not merely emperor, but a living god. Roman emperors had always flirted with divinity. Julius Caesar had been deified after death. Augustus had temples dedicated to him once he was gone. But Caligula was not content to wait for death. He wanted worship now. He demanded sacrifices to his name, offerings at his altars, priests dedicated to his service. To stand before him was no longer to stand before a ruler. It was to stand before a god, or so he demanded. And it gets worse. He did not simply accept the worship of Rome. He expanded it, forcing his cult onto conquered peoples. In the provinces, statues of Caligula were erected in temples, sometimes beside the gods they had worshipped for centuries, other times replacing them altogether. The message was unmistakable. Your traditions, your deities, your sacred spaces all bend to me. I am not man. I am divine. One of his most reckless acts was his order to have a statue of himself installed in the Temple of Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in the ancient world. For the Jewish people, who forbade graven images, this was more than an insult. It was sacrilege. The order nearly sparked a revolt so great that even his own governors hesitated to carry it out. Only Caligula's assassination prevented a catastrophe that might have torn apart the empire. But the very fact that he commanded it reveals how far his madness reached. Inside Rome, the demands for worship grew more bizarre. He dressed as various gods, Mercury one day, Apollo the next, sometimes Venus, wearing the robes of a goddess with jewels glittering against his skin. He ordered citizens to address him by divine titles. To hesitate, to stumble, even to appear less than enthusiastic could mean death. Worship was not optional, and it was not enough to obey. It had to be done with zeal, with trembling devotion, as though one truly believed. Anything less was punished with execution. Imagine the scene. Senators who once debated laws now bowing to a man in a goddess's gown, whispering prayers they did not believe. Citizens forced to pour wine on altars to the emperor, their hands shaking, knowing that if they showed the faintest doubt, they could be dragged away and killed. Rome itself became a stage where worship was not a choice, but a performance, one graded by a ruler whose pleasure decided life and death. And worse still, Caligula did not limit his godhood to Rome. He mocked the gods of old, claiming he was greater than Jupiter, greater than Mars, greater even than the fates themselves. He boasted that he could kill a man and bring him back to life, and then ordered executions to prove the first part, while laughing that no resurrection would follow. He played with divine roles the way a child plays with toys, discarding and claiming identities at whim, always at the expense of those forced to watch. For the Romans, who held religion as the backbone of their society, this was more than blasphemy. It was chaos. Festivals and rituals that had bound communities together for centuries now revolved around one man's ego. Traditional gods were sidelined. Sacred rites became parodies. Temples became monuments, not to eternity, but to a tyrant's vanity. And through it all, Caligula smiled, reveling in the silence of those who dared not object. The cruelty lay not only in the demands, but in the punishments. Suetonius records that Caligula executed people who failed to worship him properly, not with enough fervor, not with the right words, not with the right expression on their faces. Imagine living in a world where your very survival depended on convincing a madman that you adored him as a god. Every gesture, every bow, every whispered prayer became a matter of life or death. What happened after was predictable. Fear spread not just of the emperor's power, but of his gaze. Citizens rehearsed their devotion the way an actor rehearses lines, terrified that the slightest slip would be noticed. Priests who once presided over sacred rituals, now found themselves reduced to flatterers, their chants hollow, their faith meaningless. Caligula had stripped religion of its dignity and turned it into a theater of fear, and yet, even declaring himself a god was not the height of his depravity. It was shocking, it was blasphemous, but it was still only a step towards something darker. For Caligula's most horrific practice was not about divine titles or temples. It was about cruelty so raw that ancient writers hesitated to even describe it. The final practice we uncover was so disturbing that Rome never forgot it, and you've likely never heard it told in full. Even after demanding worship as a living god, Caligula's hunger for domination was not satisfied. Titles, temples, and forced devotion gave him power over Rome's soul, but they did not quench his fascination with raw suffering. What came next was the darkest side of his reign, acts so horrific, so taboo, that even ancient historians, men accustomed to blood and scandal, hesitated to put them into words. These stories linger not because they are well known, but because they were whispered in tones of disbelief, as if Rome itself recoiled from remembering. Caligula was not content with executions alone. Death by a quick stroke of the sword held little appeal for him. He preferred to draw it out, to make pain an art form. Witnesses describe him watching victims beaten slowly, each blow carefully measured, so as not to kill too quickly. He ordered others sawn apart, not swiftly, but inch by inch, prolonging the agony so that their cries filled the air while he reclined nearby, smiling as though entertained by music. To Caligula, suffering was not a byproduct of punishment. It was the point. And it gets worse. He did not confine this cruelty to criminals or enemies. He deliberately chose parents and children, forcing them to witness one another's torment. He enjoyed watching parents executed in front of their children, savoring the despair etched into young faces as they watched the people who had given them life torn away in agony. Other times he reversed it, killing children in front of their parents, leaving mothers and fathers broken beyond repair, their lives hollow shells after the spectacle. These were not punishments to prevent rebellion. They were psychological tortures designed to break the human spirit. What happened after these spectacles was even more grotesque. Some sources whisper of feasts where Caligula's cruelty reached its most unthinkable climax. There are accounts, debated but recorded nonetheless, that he ordered parts of noble families served at banquets, mocking their memory by consuming their flesh or forcing others to do so. Whether this was exaggeration by horrified chroniclers or a reflection of actual events, the very existence of the claim shows how Rome remembered him, not merely as a tyrant, but as a monster whose appetites defied humanity. Imagine the scene. The palace glitters with torches, goblets overflow with wine, and senators sit rigid in silence, knowing that any laughter they offer must sound genuine or risk their lives. Slaves bring forward trays, not of lamb or boar, but of something unrecognizable, something whispered to have been taken from the bodies of the condemned. The emperor smiles as his guests shift in horror, daring them to refuse, daring them to reveal fear. Whether fact or legend, the story survives because it captures a truth about Caligula. His reign blurred the line between banquet and slaughterhouse, between ruler and beast. Roman historians struggled to describe these acts. Suetonius, Dio, and others, though hostile to Caligula, do not linger on these stories as they do on other scandals. The details appear as fragments, half concealed, as though the writers themselves recoiled at putting such horrors fully to parchment, and that silence may be the loudest testimony of all. For what could make men who recorded the crucifixions of thousands, the butchery of wars, and the corruption of emperors hesitate, except a cruelty so raw that even they could not bear to write it plainly? The genius and the terror of this cruelty lay in how it was ritualized. Caligula did not lash out in fits of madness alone. He staged these horrors deliberately, shaping them into performances. Pain was arranged like a play, suffering choreographed like music. Each spectacle was a reminder that the emperor's power was not limited by reason or morality. It was limited only by his imagination, and that imagination was twisted toward cruelty. The impact on Rome was devastating. Senators who had once endured humiliation now lived in fear of being forced to witness horrors they could not even describe. Families who had survived executions now dreaded the possibility of spectacles worse than death. Citizens whispered rumors that spread like wildfire, each tale more grotesque than the last, each one reinforcing the same truth. Their emperor was no man, no god, but something else entirely. And worse still, the memory of these acts did not vanish with his death. They lingered in Roman consciousness as examples of what happens when absolute power is married to absolute cruelty. The name of Caligula became a byword for madness, but that word alone is not enough. Madness implies chaos, a lack of control. What Rome feared most was not that Caligula was mad, but that he was deliberate. His horrors were not accidents. They were choices. This was not the fury of a mind unraveling. This was cruelty sharpened into ritual, a spectacle crafted with intent. And in the end, even Rome itself, a city that had witnessed centuries of war, bloodshed, and tyranny, trembled before him. Caligula had shown them that horror could be systematized, that suffering could be entertainment, that even the most sacred bonds of family could be twisted into tools of fear. This was not madness alone. It was cruelty, sharpened into ritual, making even Rome afraid of its own emperor. The palace is lit once more by torches, their glow casting long shadows on marble walls. The same walls that had echoed with laughter at humiliations, the same halls that had seen nobles paraded like slaves and families broken apart. Caligula struts through them, dressed in robes glittering with jewels, certain of his divinity. His face shines with the arrogance of a man who believes himself untouchable, eternal. Around him, courtiers and guards bow, their expressions carefully measured, their voices trembling with rehearsed devotion. He does not notice the silence beneath their words, the heavy looks they exchange when his back is turned. Because while Caligula believed himself a god, those closest to him had already decided his fate. The very men who had watched him desecrate family, humiliate the Senate, and torture the innocent had reached their breaking point. In secret, daggers had been sharpened, whispers traded, loyalties tested. And on a January day in 41 CE, the emperor who thought himself immortal discovered how mortal he truly was. The assassination came suddenly, almost brutally poetic in its simplicity. As Caligula left a performance, surrounded by his attendants, the plotters struck. Daggers flashed in the torchlight, cutting into his flesh again and again. The emperor, who had watched others writhe in pain, now gasped for his own life, shocked not that he was dying, but that anyone dared to kill him. Guards stood frozen, unwilling to intervene, perhaps relieved that the nightmare was ending. When the final blow fell, Caligula's body lay on the ground, stripped of its godhood, just another corpse cooling on the palace floor. His reign had lasted only 4 years, yet in that brief span he had scarred Rome in ways that would echo for centuries. His practices, the humiliation of nobles, the desecration of family, the random executions, the palace brothel, the demand for worship, the ritualized horrors, etched themselves into the collective memory of an empire that prided itself on power and order. The Romans would endure many cruel emperors after him, but few would ever inspire the same shudder of revulsion. Caligula did not simply rule, he consumed. He devoured dignity, family, and tradition, feeding on the suffering of others as though cruelty itself were a feast. And even 2,000 years later, the shadows of his reign remain. His name has become synonymous with madness, but madness alone cannot explain what he did. His legacy is not of chaos, but of deliberate, sharpened cruelty, a reminder of how power, unchecked, can turn a man into a monster. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.